My son told guests, "He's just our driver." 3 days later, I needed my signature on the deed. "Don't mind him, everyone. He's just our driver." That was the sentence that changed everything. Not shouted, not cruel in tone at all. Just my son's voice, smooth and practiced, tossed casually over his shoulder to a room full of his business partners, aimed at the quiet old man in a worn jacket who had just carried in 2 cases of wine from the truck and set them down without a word. But we'll get there. 3 days after that party, I was sitting in a bank's private conference room, watching my son's loan officer slide a refinancing document across the table, explaining, with visible discomfort, that the application couldn't proceed without a second signature, mine, because the building his entire business operated out of had never actually belonged to him at all. I remember the exact moment the loan officer looked up from the property records on her screen and said, "Mr. Holloway, this parcel has a single recorded owner, and it isn't your son, it's you." And I remember my son sitting beside me finally understanding exactly whose driveway he'd been parking his ambition in for the last 12 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where this really begins. My name is Bernard Holloway. I'm 71 years old. I live alone in a small house on the edge of a quiet town, in the same modest place my wife Louise and I bought 40 years ago. Back when I was still running a small chain of hardware stores I'd built up from a single rented storefront, with nothing but a truck, a line of credit, and more stubbornness than good sense. Louise passed 5 years ago. I still keep her gardening gloves on a hook by the back door, mostly because I've never found a good enough reason to move them. I drive an old pickup truck, the same one I've had for almost 15 years, because it still runs fine, and because I've never seen much point in replacing something that isn't broken. Some mornings I take it out just to hear the engine turn over, the way old men do when a routine is the only company they've got left before noon. Here's the thing about me that my son Gregory grew up mostly not appreciating, even though the paperwork of it sat quietly in a filing cabinet in my den his entire life. 38 years ago, I built that hardware chain into something substantial enough that when I finally sold the operating business itself, 12 years back, I made one deliberate decision that almost nobody outside my attorney's office fully understood. I kept the commercial building the flagship store operated out of, held entirely in my own name, and leased it to the new owners, which eventually became my son's own company once he bought into the operation and took it over. I made that decision for a simple reason. I'd watched too many small business owners over the decades lose everything at once: the inventory, the goodwill, the building itself, the moment a single bad year or a single bad decision came along. Separating the real estate from the operating business had always struck me as basic prudence, the kind of thing any careful businessman would do given the choice. I never once considered it a secret. I considered it common sense that simply never came up in conversation because nobody ever asked. I never made a show of that decision. Gregory knew, in some vague way, that Dad still owns the building, the way you know a fact without ever bothering to understand its actual weight. He paid rent to a property management company I quietly controlled, never fully registering that the modest checks he wrote every month were going, ultimately, to his own father. I didn't correct his understanding of it, not out of secrecy for its own sake, but because Louise and I had always agreed that Gregory should feel like he'd built his half of the business through his own effort, not like he was operating inside his father's shadow with a permanent safety net underneath him. Gregory grew up, took over daily operations of the company, and over the years, particularly after marrying his wife Adrian, developed a very specific idea of what success was supposed to look like. The right country club, the right circle of business partners, the right image projected at every gathering, an image that increasingly had less and less room in it for a father who still drove an old truck and wore work jackets to family functions. At Gregory and Adrian's 10th anniversary party, a lavish affair at a hotel ballroom attended by half the local business community, I arrived a little late, having driven 2 cases of wine over myself after the delivery service Gregory hired failed to show up on time. I carried the cases in through the side entrance, set them down near the bar, and was still standing there, jacket a little rumpled from the effort, when one of Gregory's business partners turned to him and asked, gesturing toward me, Is that the wine delivery, finally? Don't mind him, everyone, Gregory said, with an easy, practiced smile, not missing a beat. He's just our driver. The room laughed, lightly, the way rooms do, at a comment that isn't meant maliciously, but lands exactly like one anyway. I stood there for a moment, in my own son's anniversary party, being introduced to a room full of strangers as hired help, and I want to be honest and tell you it took me a moment to decide how to respond. I settled on saying nothing at all. I nodded, found a quiet corner, and let the evening continue without correcting a single word of it. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't angry at Gregory in the way people are angry at strangers. Gregory wasn't cruel by nature. He'd simply built, over years, an increasingly polished version of his own success story, one where a quiet, truck-driving father didn't fit the narrative he wanted his business partners to see, and correcting the driver comment in front of that particular crowd would have meant explaining a truth about our arrangement that Gregory himself had never fully sat with. There was a dinner, maybe 2 years before that party, where Adrian mentioned, in front of her own parents, that Gregory had built the whole operation basically from scratch. A description that wasn't entirely false, but that conveniently left out the building itself, the one asset that had never actually been his to build from scratch at all. I let the comment pass. The way you let a lot of comments pass when correcting them means turning a family dinner into an argument about who actually owns what. There was a company holiday party the year before that where Gregory introduced me to a new hire as "my dad, retired, keeps busy with his truck and his garden," a description accurate enough on its surface, but delivered with the specific tone of a man quietly managing how much credibility his father was allowed to carry in front of employees who might otherwise start asking inconvenient questions about the building's actual ownership. There was an afternoon, about 8 months ago, when I stopped by the store to drop off some paperwork Gregory had asked me to sign regarding routine building maintenance, and I overheard him on the phone with a supplier through his office door before I knocked. "Yeah, my dad still holds the paper on the building. Technicality mostly. We've basically been running it as ours for years now." I stood in that hallway holding a folder for a good 10 seconds, listening to my own son describe an ownership arrangement as a mere technicality, and then I knocked, handed him the paperwork, and asked how the new supplier deal was coming along. He never knew I'd heard a word. There was a golf outing maybe 6 months before the anniversary party where Gregory introduced me to a potential business partner as my dad, semi-retired, does a little handyman work around the property still. A description technically true but delivered with the same careful management I'd come to expect, positioning me somewhere between charming eccentric and mildly useful staff rather than the man whose signature alone could unwind the entire arrangement his company depended on. There was a moment, at that same anniversary party, before the wine delivery mix-up, when Adrian's mother asked me directly what I used to do for work, and before I could answer, Gregory appeared at my elbow and said, smoothly, "Dad kept himself busy with some small properties over the years, nothing too exciting," steering the conversation back toward his own recent industry award, before I had a chance to clarify what some small properties actually meant. What none of us fully appreciated, including Gregory, who I don't believe ever looked closely enough at his own lease agreement to understand the actual terms, was that the modest rent he'd been paying all these years had never once been adjusted for a refinancing clause I'd built in decades earlier. A clause requiring my direct signature for any modification to the building's financing structure, specifically to prevent exactly the kind of leveraged risk-taking Gregory's expanding ambitions had recently started flirting with. I didn't know any of that would matter so soon. What I knew, at the time of that anniversary party, was that Gregory's company had been quietly taking on more debt than I fully understood, expanding into a second location, a decision made, I would later learn, primarily to impress the same circle of business partners who'd laughed politely at his driver joke. 3 days after that party, Gregory called me, his voice carrying an urgency I hadn't heard from him in years. "Dad, I need a favor. There's some refinancing paperwork on the building. Standard stuff. Just needs your signature, since your name's still technically on the original deed. Can you swing by the bank this afternoon?" "What exactly does it refinance?" I asked. It's just restructuring some of the existing terms, extending things a bit. Pretty routine, he said, in the same easy, practiced tone he'd used at the party. The tone of a man who assumed the details didn't require much scrutiny from an old man who drove a truck for a living. I want to tell you honestly what happened in me in that moment, because I think it matters. Something that had been quiet and patient for over a decade opened its eyes very calmly, without any drama at all. Not anger, not panic, just a stillness. The specific clarity of a man who spent 38 years reading the fine print on every deal that ever mattered to his business, and who had never once stopped reading it just because his son assumed he'd lost the habit. "I'll come by," I said, "but I'll be reading every page myself before I sign anything." At the bank, in a private conference room, the loan officer walked us both through the actual proposed refinancing. Not a routine restructuring at all, but a substantial second mortgage against the building, leveraged to cover the expansion costs of Gregory's new location, structured in a way that would have placed the original building, my building, at direct risk if the second location underperformed. "This isn't routine," I said, once I'd finished reading it properly. "This puts the flagship building itself as collateral for a business expansion that has nothing to do with why I originally kept ownership separate." "Dad, it's fine. The numbers work. I've run this by our accountant." "Your accountant doesn't have signature authority on this building," I said. "I do, and I'm not signing something that puts 40 years of careful ownership at risk for a second location you decided to open, partly to impress people who think of me as your driver." "That's not fair," Gregory said, his voice rising slightly. "This has nothing to do with the party." "Doesn't it?" I asked. 3 days ago, you needed me to be invisible enough that a room full of your partners wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions about who I actually am. Today, you need me to sign away the one thing that's kept this whole operation stable for over a decade. I'd say those two things are more related than you'd like them to be." The room went quiet. Gregory's face, I noticed, shifted from mild irritation to something closer to genuine surprise, as though the possibility of me actually reading the document, actually understanding it, actually exercising the authority I'd quietly held for over a decade, hadn't seriously occurred to him until that exact moment. "Mr. Holloway," the loan officer said carefully, looking between us, "I should clarify. The property records show a single owner on this parcel, recorded well before your son's company began operating from the location. Any modification requires his direct, informed consent. That's not a technicality. That's the actual structure of this deal." "I understand the structure perfectly," I said. "I built it that way myself, 38 years ago, specifically so that no single bad decision could ever put everything at risk at once. I'm not signing this today." Gregory sat back in his chair, and for a long moment, nobody said anything at all. "Why didn't you ever tell me the terms were this strict?" he finally asked, his voice quieter now, some of the practiced ease gone out of it entirely. "Because your mother and I agreed you should build your half of this business believing you'd earned every inch of it yourself," I said, "not leaning on a safety net you didn't fully understand the shape of. Maybe that was the wrong call in the end. I don't know anymore. But it came from wanting you proud of something you built, not something you inherited without noticing. I called you our driver in front of 40 people," he said quietly, 3 days ago, "and now I'm sitting here asking you to save the whole operation with a signature." "I noticed," I said. "Both things." "Did it bother you?" he asked. "At the party, when I said it." "Every time something like that happens, it bothers me," I said. "But I've learned to separate the sting of it from the decision of whether it's worth a scene. That night wasn't the night for a scene. Today might have been, except I'd rather solve the actual problem than spend the meeting arguing about a joke." "I don't even remember deciding to say it," he admitted. "It just came out, like it was already loaded, ready to go, and I'd said some version of it enough times that it didn't even register as unkind anymore." "That's usually how these things work," I said. "Nobody decides, consciously, to demote their own father to hired help. It just accumulates, one small comment at a time, until it's simply how you talk about him without thinking." The weeks that followed were their own kind of difficult. There's a version of this story where the bank conference room is the climax and everything after is a footnote, but that's not how these things actually resolve, and I want to be honest about that. Real resolution is slow. It's Gregory sitting with his accountant and a more conservative financing structure that didn't require putting the original building at risk. It's a formal meeting where the loan officer walked through, line by line, exactly what the original ownership terms protected against, and exactly how close the expansion plan had come to threatening all of it at once. There was a day, about 3 weeks later, when Gregory came to my house unannounced, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table with none of his usual polish. "I've been thinking about the driver comment," he said. "I told myself it was just a joke, the kind of thing that doesn't mean anything. But I don't think that's true. I think some part of me has spent years quietly editing you out of the version of my success I show to other people, because a father who drives a truck and still owns the building doesn't fit the story I wanted to tell about building this myself." "That's an honest thing to say," I said. "Is it too late to say I'm sorry for it?" he asked. "No," I said, "but I'd rather you show me than tell me. Going forward. There's a difference between an apology and a changed habit." "What would showing you look like?" he asked, and I could tell the question was sincere rather than rhetorical. "Introducing me accurately when it costs you something to do it," I said. "Not just at family dinners where it's easy. At the moments when a business partner might actually ask a follow-up question you'd rather avoid." He nodded slowly, and I watched him actually consider the weight of that, rather than simply agreeing to move the conversation along. I watched my son, in the weeks after that, do something I hadn't fully seen him do before. At the company's next holiday gathering, when a business partner asked, in passing, about the building situation, Gregory said, without hesitation, "My father owns that building outright. Has for decades. Every bit of stability this company has ever had exists because he was careful enough to protect it, even when I wasn't always grateful for the caution." Nobody laughed this time. A few people, I noticed, looked at me with something closer to genuine respect than they ever had before. I didn't feel triumphant when it was over. I want to be honest about that too. I felt tired, the specific tired that comes after finally naming something you'd been quietly worried about for longer than you'd admitted to yourself. I thought about Louise a great deal in those weeks. What she would have said, watching 38 years of careful protection nearly get signed away for the sake of an expansion built partly on wanting to impress the wrong people. Watching our son finally sit with real discomfort about a joke he'd told without thinking. I think Louise would have been proudest, not of the bank conference room, but of that kitchen table conversation. It's been almost a year now. Gregory comes by most Sundays now, sometimes with the grandchildren, and we sit on the back porch and don't always talk about anything important, which is its own kind of gift after a year like that one. The grandchildren, in particular, have started asking me questions about the old hardware chain that Gregory himself never thought to ask growing up. How I chose the first location, how I decided which stores to open next, what it felt like the day I finally paid off the original loan. I found myself telling those stories more freely to them than I ever did to Gregory at their age, and I think, in his better moments, Gregory notices that too, and doesn't entirely mind it. He asked me, a few months ago, to finally walk him through the building's full history. Not because he needed anything from it, he was careful to clarify, but because he wanted to understand what his father had actually built, so he could understand it as something more than a technicality attached to a lease he'd never read closely. I spent an afternoon showing him the original purchase documents, the deliberate decision Louise and I made to keep it separate, the specific protective clauses built in for exactly this kind of moment. "Why didn't you ever just explain all this properly?" he asked. "Because I didn't want you to know your father as a landlord," I said. "I wanted you to know him as a father. I still do. The landlord protected the building. The father was for making sure you never had to think about the building at all until you were ready to understand it properly." He looked at the old documents a long moment, then up at me. "You could have told me sooner," he said. "Not for the building's sake. For mine. I spent years being embarrassed by a version of you I never bothered to actually understand, and I almost put everything at risk because of it. I think about that often now. How much of the people we love we simply never fully see? Not because they're hiding on purpose, but because we've already decided, quietly and long ago, what shape we expect them to take. Gregory looked at me for years and saw a quiet old man in a truck, useful mostly for hauling wine cases and keeping the tools in the garage organized. He wasn't entirely wrong that I preferred a quiet life. He was wrong about nearly everything else. Some evenings now, I sit on the porch with a cup of decaf and think about how strange the shape of a life turns out to be. I spent 38 years being a careful, quiet steward of something I rarely discussed, not because I hid it out of secrecy, but because I never once thought it needed announcing before it was time. Louise used to say, I protected things the way other men build monuments, quietly, methodically, without needing anyone to applaud the effort. I think she understood the shape of that discipline better than I ever articulated it myself. I think, too, about how easy it is to let a small joke calcify into a genuine misunderstanding, simply because correcting it in the moment feels like more trouble than it's worth. Gregory's driver comment wasn't the first small dismissal, and it likely wouldn't have been the last if a refinancing deadline hadn't forced a much larger conversation between us. I understand now, in a way I couldn't have understood at 40, that letting small things pass uncorrected doesn't make them disappear. It just gives them time to compound into something larger, until circumstance eventually forces the correction whether you're ready for it or not. I don't regret the years of staying quiet about the building's actual terms. I want to say that plainly, because I know some people hearing this will wonder why I let the misunderstanding go on as long as I did. I'd do it again. Every quiet dinner where Gregory's version of his own success left me out of the story. Every year he grew up believing the safety net beneath him was smaller than it actually was. I would trade all of it again for a son who learned to run his half of that business believing he'd earned every inch of it himself. That's what a father owes his son, the way I see it. Not a number, a reason to build something of his own. What I do regret, if I'm honest, is not correcting the driver comment the moment it happened, before it had 3 more days to sit unaddressed between us, before a refinancing deadline forced a much larger conversation out of both of us at once. I thought silence was a form of humility. What I've learned, watching my son finally sit with real discomfort at my own kitchen table, is that some things need correcting the moment they happen, gently but clearly, rather than absorbed quietly and left to compound. Gregory mistook my quiet caution for something small and forgettable. For a while I let him. I don't blame him entirely. I built that impression myself, year by careful year, for reasons that made sense to me at the time. But I'm glad, in the end, that the truth finally had its say, and that it arrived in time to matter. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a porch in the evening, once the light has gone soft and the only sound left is the old truck engine ticking as it cools in the driveway. I sit in that quiet most nights now, and I don't feel any poorer for the years I spent being mistaken for hired help at my own son's party. If anything, I feel more at peace than I have in a long while. Not because Gregory finally introduced me properly at a company gathering, but because the truth about what I actually built, and what I chose to protect, is finally sitting in the open where both of us can see it clearly. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from all this, it's this. The quietest person at the party is not always the least important, and the humblest truck in the driveway does not tell you the whole story of the man driving it. Don't mistake someone's modesty for the entirety of what they've built and protected. And don't wait until you need someone's signature to finally ask them who they really are underneath the quiet life they chose to show you. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone in your life who's underestimated the quiet ones. Somebody out there needs to hear it today.